Hi, David here, and welcome back to the channel, where we're looking at the teaching of divine love through the automatic writings of the early 20th century medium James Padgett. In this series of videos, starting with 10.1, we look at messages James Padgett received from Jesus and those closely associated with him. Today, we shift focus slightly away from what divine love is and how to share in it, so as to understand why that was a difficult message to get across, even when people could hear about it directly from Jesus himself. To do this, we're going to look at a message James Padgett received on May 24, 1915. The message begins, "I am here, Jesus. You are feeling better tonight, and I will try to write a little. I do not know if you are in condition to take a formal message, but I will tell you some things that will be of interest to you and humanity." We've noticed in one or two videos already that Jesus draws a distinction between what he calls formal messages, which convey information of spiritual significance, and which require a fuller rapport with James Padgett than is always possible in the moment, and what we might call more informal messages, where Jesus shares information about his personal history or background information about his own development. Conveying these informal messages doesn't require such a close rapport with James Padgett, because they don't involve trying to get through James's mind things that he has never previously imagined. Information about Jesus' family background, details of the times in which he lived, and descriptions of what he and his followers did might be new, but these are all the kind of things that will immediately make sense. They don't require us to get our heads around something new. So James's mind will recognize them, which means it's easier for Jesus to convey them through that particular medium. When someone in spirit wishes to convey an idea, a piece of knowledge, or an understanding that is entirely new, the rapport between the medium and the communicator needs to be much closer, because the communicator needs to be able to overcome the lack of comprehension by the medium's mind and push it through anyway. So on those evenings when James's spiritual condition is not what Jesus might have hoped for, Jesus tends to take the opportunity to share historical or personal information which he regards as less important than his spiritual teachings, but which he knows James and others will still find of interest. It's also still worth doing this because it gives James more experience as a medium, which, like any other skill, develops with practice. So Jesus takes the opportunity of this message to explain why his teachings were not always easy to get across to people, telling us that when I came to the world to teach the truths of my Father, the world was almost devoid of spiritual conception of the true relationship of God to man. And God was a being of power and wrath only. It was because of this conception of him that the Jews were so devoid of the true knowledge of his nature and attributes. They only knew him as a God who was interested in their material welfare and did not realize that he was a God who wanted them to know him as their spiritual father and savior from the sins and evil natures that they possessed. Consequently, when I came, they looked upon me, I mean those who accepted me as their Messiah, as one who would redeem them from the slavery which their Roman conquerors had placed them in, and make them a great and independent nation, more powerful than all the nations of the earth, and fitted to rule the whole earth. They had no conception of my true mission on earth, and even my disciples, until shortly before my death, merely looked upon me as a saviour of them from the burdens which the Roman yoke had placed upon them. So what we're being asked to picture is a world in which God was simply a being to be feared or obeyed, and who might intervene in worldly affairs when it suited him. The idea of God as a God of love, who was interested in each of us as one of his children, was simply not the common view of who or what God is. The common idea of God, as relevant to worldly affairs, was, and is, a worldly or materialistic one, which not only characterized Jewish attitudes, but also those of the nations around them. Indeed, Jews were slightly ahead of many of their neighbours in accepting that there is only one God. So we see that this understanding of God is interested in worldly affairs rather than the spirituality of each human soul, was also expressed in the expectation that the Messiah would be a political leader who would defeat Rome, or at least free the Jewish nation from its foreign occupier, an expectation that Jesus simply wasn't interested in. Jesus tells us that the only one of my disciples who had any approximate realization of what my coming to earth meant was John. And that was because of the great amount of love that seemed to be a part of his nature and being. To him, I explained my real mission and taught him the spiritual truths which I came to teach, and the only way in which mortals could receive that love of the Father, which was necessary to make them at one with him and enable them to partake of his divinity. Hence, only in John's Gospel is written the one necessary requirement to a full salvation and redemption of humanity. I mean the declaration that men must be born again in order to enter into the kingdom of heaven. This is the only true way by which a man can become a true child of the Father, and fitted to live in and enjoy his kingdom to the fullest. As we've seen, sharing in divine love and thereby being at one with God is the key thing that Jesus taught. The place where such souls might live in the afterlife is the only place or kingdom that Jesus was interested in seeing established. From what Jesus says here, John was the only one of his disciples to have even an approximate realization of this, which suggests that even John's understanding wasn't as complete as it might have been. Jesus goes on to say, the other disciples had a more or less conception of this necessary truth, but not the full comprehension of what it involved. Peter was more possessed of this love than were the other disciples, except John, and with it he also understood that I was the true Son of my Father, but he never understood or declared that I was God. He was a man filled with zeal and ambition, though his development of love was not sufficient to enable him to fully realize that my kingdom was not to be an earthly one, until after my death, and then the conviction came to him in all its truth and fullness, and he became the most powerful and influential of all my disciples. So although Peter was keen and ambitious, even he didn't have a clear understanding of what Jesus teaches until after the trauma of his execution. As Jesus goes on to say, after the Pentecost, all of my disciples understood what my real mission was, and they went into the world and preached the true doctrine of my mission on earth, and the love of the Father for his children, and the fact that that love was waiting for all who should seek for it. For those who've heard of it but aren't sure, Pentecost is a word that means 50th, and which refers to the Jewish festival of Shavuot, which is celebrated 50 days after Passover. The significance of Pentecost for Jesus' disciples is that this was when God's Spirit, his divine love, was shared with them sufficiently for them to understand what it was that Jesus had been trying to teach them, and for them to become living exemplars of that teaching as he was. This is interesting because it acts as a reminder of Jesus' own Jewish background and reminds us that even though he had a new understanding of God, Jewish scriptural writings and traditions were still significant for him and his disciples. The other reason this is interesting is because it underlines the importance of personal experience of spirit in enabling people to accept and understand its reality. Speaking for myself, it's my years experiencing spirit and working as a medium, knowing what it is to communicate with people in spirit, that opens the door to me accepting the reality of spirit. So long as it remains an idea or mental belief, it might never convince, particularly in a world that often remains inclined to dismiss it as a deluded superstition. That kind of materialistic mindset is part of what Jesus had to contend with when he was here. As he goes on to say, "So you see that many of my disciples when on earth were not possessed of the true conception of my mission, and were not true followers of me in that inner meaning of what the love of God meant and what I tried to preach to them. I now have on earth many mortals who understand my teachings better, and with a greater extent of soul knowledge than did my disciples when journeying with me through Palestine. But there are a great many men and women now living who do not understand my teachings, even though they think they understand the Bible and the interpretations of its discourses in accordance with the accepted doctrines of the learned and so-called teachers of its truths." The New Testament, as it has come down to us, has been subjected to a great deal of editing and rewriting over the centuries, some of it obvious even to a casual reader. Without the knowledge of what it was that Jesus tried to teach, it is possible to get completely the wrong end of the stick, simply because what Jesus taught is not clearly stated. In this message, Jesus does say that John's Gospel is the only one that indicates what it was that Jesus taught, because it retains the phrase "born again" to describe those who are suited to the higher or celestial heavens. The problem is that you need to know what that phrase is pointing to. What it points to is the change or rebirth that a soul undergoes when it shares in divine love. And it's important to remind that this is an actual process of change in the stuff the soul is made of. It's not a change in understanding or perspective or a mental belief in this or that church teaching or feeling that you belong to this or that church. There are plenty of people in this world who happily and sincerely describe themselves as born again, but who are not. Equally, there are people who have begun to share in divine love as a result of their sincerity and acceptance of the reality of God and Spirit, even if their mental understanding or beliefs are not quite in alignment with the full reality of that process. This is a process that takes place at the soul level. God's love comes to the open heart who seeks it. It's not something that happens in response to mental or intellectual activity, which is why this process can happen despite mistaken ideas about God and Spirit. But as the experience grows in fullness, understanding will eventually follow. This is why it's always much more important to convey the knowledge of divine love as something that God seeks to share with us in response to us wanting to share it. Everyone who embarks on that process of change will come to a right understanding in time, even if they do not have it when they start the journey. Just as sharing in divine love is a process, like any relationship, so too is the understanding that will come as a result of that experience. Share the knowledge of divine love with even one other soul, and you will achieve more than can be accomplished with any number of theological debates, however much your ego might enjoy winning them. Jesus concludes this message by saying to James Padgett, "I don't feel that you can write more tonight, and so I will stop. But say that you must continue to get stronger, spiritually and physically, so that we can continue our writings more rapidly and with greater satisfaction. So believe that I am Jesus, your true friend and brother, who is with you very much, trying to help you and to make you happy and contented. With my love and prayers, I am Jesus." The next video in this sequence, video 10.5, will be uploaded next Sunday. And we'll look at another message from Jesus in which he explains that length of time in spirit is not always a marker of reliability or progress. People in spirit vary in the extent to which they wish to work at their spiritual development. In this respect, as in so many others, we don't change just because the physical body dies and we have to start living somewhere else. So I hope you'll join me for that. The next midweek video will look at another message from James Padgett's old law professor, Joseph Salyards, sharing his experience of how things work in spirit. It's quite a long message, so I may end up doing it over 2 videos, but I'll see when I get to recording it. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed this video, please take a moment to like it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And there's a lot of fascinating material to share in the months ahead, so I hope you'll stay with me for that. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon. Take care.